"You're completely useless without me," Vanessa said, her voice sharp and deliberate, echoing through the dining room as if the words were meant to carve themselves into my mind. The room fell quiet for a moment, my colleagues freezing mid-laugh, forks hovering over plates, eyes darting between us. I sat still, letting the words land, feeling the sting but not reacting outwardly. My hand tightened around the glass of water in front of me, not in anger, not in fear, just in that controlled calm that had kept me afloat all these years. I remembered the first time I walked into the Whitaker Supply Group offices, the hum of machinery and the scent of fresh-cut lumber greeting me, a young man with nothing but ambition and calloused hands, thinking this was the life I wanted, thinking that building something tangible from the ground up would give me purpose. And it did, in ways that Vanessa never noticed, never acknowledged. She had always been the one to navigate the social events, the client dinners, the ribbon cuttings, smiling as if she alone had steered the company to its current success. But I knew better. I had been behind every blueprint, every deal, every late night in the office making sure payroll was met, materials delivered, projects finished on time. Yet she had convinced herself and everyone around her that without her guidance, I was nothing. Her smirk widened as she spoke, leaning slightly forward as though punctuating the humiliation with her posture. I looked around the room and caught the brief glance of Caleb Morrison, my lawyer, sitting across the table, quietly observing, eyes sharp, noting every expression, every micro-reaction, the kind of observer who could turn a small piece of evidence into a turning point. I let my breath slow, counting in my mind, recalling every subtle sign over the last few months, the unexplained charges on the company card, the whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered a room, the sudden detachment in her gaze when I mentioned upcoming projects. I had seen it all, but never reacted publicly, understanding that power could be exercised silently, that patience often yielded the clearest victories. As she continued, laughing lightly at some comment only she found amusing, I felt the familiar surge of focus settle over me. The part of me that had built this company from a one-truck operation to a multi-million-dollar supply business, the part of me that had learned long ago to measure response and plan several steps ahead. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the glass down. I simply set it gently on the table, adjusted my tie, and met her gaze, the room's ambient noise fading as if it were a backdrop for the confrontation. In that moment, I reminded myself that words, no matter how cutting, were fleeting, but evidence, structure, and foresight were lasting. Vanessa's statement had been designed to provoke, to assert dominance, to make me doubt my standing. Instead, it served as the perfect confirmation that my next moves needed precision. Later, after the gathering ended and guests drifted out into the cool night air, I retreated to my office, flipping open the ledger, reviewing every account, noting every transaction that could be questioned, every document that could demonstrate mismanagement or misuse. I took my time, methodically cross-referencing invoices and bank statements, letting the calm efficiency of the task absorb the residual sting of her words. By the time I picked up the phone to call Caleb, I felt the clarity that only comes from preparation, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the first cut had been made by her own hand, that her hubris had set the stage perfectly for the next move. The night deepened outside the office windows, but inside, I worked in steady silence, a plan forming that would shift the balance not with noise or fury, but with strategy, legal authority, and a measured revelation that would ensure Vanessa learned precisely what it meant to underestimate someone who had spent a lifetime building, waiting, and observing. By 11:40 that night, the office building was almost empty, and the quiet had a way of making every small sound feel important. The air conditioner clicked above me. The wall clock dragged its second hand around in slow, tired circles. Outside the glass, the parking lot lights spilled yellow across the asphalt, shining on my black Ford Expedition like it had been waiting for me to decide what kind of man I was going to be. I sat at my desk with 3 bank statements, 2 vendor reports, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. The numbers did not scream at first. That was the thing about financial betrayal. It did not walk through the front door wearing a name tag. It hid in clean lines, friendly descriptions, vague labels like consulting expense, client entertainment, office development, reimbursement. But when I lined the months up side by side, The pattern became impossible to ignore. $12,000 here. $18,000 there. A luxury hotel in Miami listed as a supplier conference, even though our supplier conference had been in Indianapolis. A private shopping invoice buried under marketing outreach. A transfer of $72,000 to a holding account I had never approved. My thumb rested on that page longer than the others, and for the first time that night, I felt the old ache in my chest sharpen into something colder. I was not shocked because Vanessa spent money. I had known that about her for years. I was shocked because she had stopped pretending it was our life she was spending it on. I opened my laptop and pulled up the administrator log for Whitaker Supply Group. She had accessed the business account at 6:13 in the morning, before sunrise, before coffee, before the version of herself she showed the world had even put on makeup. She had done it from our home internet connection, while I was probably in the shower, getting ready to drive to the warehouse and solve problems she would later tell people I did not understand. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles. There was a time when I would have defended her before I defended myself. I would have said Vanessa was ambitious, not selfish. Sharp, not cruel. Careful, not calculating. Marriage teaches a man to translate the person he loves into softer words. But eventually, the translation fails. The truth keeps its original shape. I thought back to the dinner only a few hours earlier, the white tablecloth, the clink of silverware, the way she had smiled before calling me useless, as if the insult were just another polished accessory. I remembered the faces around the table, the quick downward glances, the uncomfortable laughter, the small mercy of people pretending not to hear what everyone heard. Caleb had heard it too. More importantly, Caleb had understood what it meant. He was not just a lawyer I kept on retainer because the company had contracts and disputes. He was the kind of man who listened to silence as carefully as words. At 10 minutes after midnight, I called him. He answered on the third ring, his voice calm, rough with sleep, but alert in the way professionals become alert when something finally reaches the line they warned you about. I told him I had found the transfers. I told him about the holding account, the hotel charges, the vendor descriptions that did not match any vendor we used. I did not mention my pride. I did not tell him my wife had made me feel small in a room full of people. That part was not evidence. That part was just damage. Caleb let me finish, then said, "Daniel, do not confront her. Do not send a text message. Do not move money on your own. Send me everything." His voice was not dramatic. That made it heavier. I forwarded the statements, the login records, the transfer confirmations, the credit card reports, and the screenshots I had taken earlier that week when Vanessa accidentally left her tablet open on the kitchen island. One message stayed in my mind like a stain. He will never check. He does not even understand the accounts. I had stared at those words for almost a full minute when I first saw them, not because they surprised me, but because they explained her. She had not just underestimated me. She had built an entire plan on the belief that I was too trusting to look, too tired to fight, and too embarrassed to admit I had been fooled inside my own marriage. Caleb called back 23 minutes later. "This is not just a spending problem," he said. "This is exposure. Business funds, marital funds, possible dissipation. And if she was preparing to move assets before filing, we need to act before morning." I looked out at the empty parking lot and saw my reflection in the window, tie loosened, eyes steady, face older than I remembered. The man looking back at me was not furious. Fury would have been easy. Fury would have given Vanessa exactly what she expected, a loud husband she could point to later and call unstable. No, what I felt was cleaner than that. It was the strange calm that arrives when confusion finally becomes a map. Caleb told me to gather the operating agreement, the bank authorization forms, the corporate resolutions, and the old post-nuptial financial disclosure we had signed 6 years earlier after Vanessa insisted it was only for estate planning. I knew exactly where they were. Bottom drawer, black folder, left side. She had always believed I kept papers because I was sentimental. She never understood that a man who builds a company learns to keep proof because memory does not hold up in court. By 1:30 in the morning, I had everything scanned and sent. By 2:15, Caleb had already drafted the emergency request. By 3, I was standing alone in the office kitchen, rinsing out the cold coffee cup, listening to the water run, thinking about how ordinary the world can sound when your life is changing behind the walls. I did not go home. I stayed in my office, Sitting in the leather chair Vanessa once said made me look like a small-town banker pretending to be important. The insult almost made me smile now. At 6:30, my phone buzzed with a message from Caleb. Filed. Hearing pending. Temporary restraints requested. Preserve all records. I read it twice, then placed the phone face down on the desk. Sunrise started to push pale light over the warehouses across the street. Forklifts would be moving soon. Drivers would check routes. Men and women who depended on me would clock in and expect the day to function. So I stood, straightened my shirt, and did what I had always done. I went to work. Only this time, the quiet was not surrender. It was the beginning of consequence. By 8 o'clock, the city streets were starting to hum with the morning rush, taxis beeping, delivery trucks making their rounds, and the faint aroma of roasted coffee beans drifting from the corner shop across the street. I walked into the Whitaker Supply Group warehouse, leather briefcase in hand, tie still neat from the night before, and felt a calm precision settle over me that I had cultivated through years of building and maintaining this business. Employees greeted me with nods, a few casual smiles, but none could see the careful orchestration behind the calm exterior I carried. The warehouse was alive with activity, forklifts moving pallets, scanners beeping, the scent of fresh lumber mingling with industrial oil, and the faint tang of metal from the machines. I passed the shipping area, noting that every shipment matched the logs I had checked twice in the night, each order accounted for, each delivery set on schedule, just as it should be. My phone buzzed quietly in my pocket. It was Caleb. Daniel, she has noticed the freeze, he said, voice even, as though reporting the weather instead of delivering news that would unsettle most men. I nodded even though he could not see me. Vanessa had called him, demanding to know how she could access funds, but all he said was that her access was temporarily suspended pending legal review. She would not see the full extent of what had been arranged until later. I walked through the main office, past cubicles and glass partitions, each reflecting a man and a woman at work, unaware that the foundation of control had shifted quietly overnight. The employees had seen the polite version of Vanessa, the one who smiled and directed, but they had not seen the tension that accompanied her sudden inability to access the accounts she assumed were under her control. I remembered the dinner, her laughter cutting across the table, the whispered side comments, the way she had assumed superiority in every detail, believing that I was too passive, too deferential to challenge her. It was almost poetic now, how quickly the scales had shifted. I took my seat behind the large oak desk, papers neatly arranged, laptop open, and began reviewing the latest emails and notifications. Caleb had already sent the preliminary freeze order to the bank, the accounts locked, credit cards restricted, and all pending transfers suspended. Each confirmation email made my jaw tighten slightly, a quiet satisfaction that this was not about anger, but about precision. At 10:30, Vanessa had sent a message that pinged insistently on my phone. Daniel, what is happening? I cannot access the funds. Call me immediately. I did not answer. I did not feel the need to. Instead, I pulled the folder containing scanned records, statements, and authorization forms closer, reviewing every transaction, every note that had been highlighted the night before. This was no longer a game of perception. It was documentation, evidence, and calculated consequence. By 11, the first courier deliveries began arriving, invoices in hand, verifying that shipments had been processed correctly, that no operations had been disrupted despite the financial freeze. The employees moved with efficiency, a silent testament to the systems I had built, systems that did not rely on theatrics or confrontation, only planning, oversight, and quiet authority. Outside the large windows, sunlight cut through the blinds, painting stripes across the concrete floor, and I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath. The calm was deceptive, a mask that hid the full measure of control I now exercised behind the scenes. I had learned long ago that the appearance of weakness could be misleading, that patience and strategy often yielded outcomes far more satisfying than impulsive confrontation. At 12:15, Caleb sent a brief text confirming that all freeze requests were active and binding, that any attempt to circumvent them would be legally enforceable and documented. I reviewed it once, twice, making note of the timestamps, then set the phone aside. My mind was clear, focused on operational priorities, the daily tasks of keeping the business running smoothly, ensuring that nothing else was affected by the behind-the-scenes actions that would soon reach Vanessa. By mid-afternoon, the first indirect messages arrived. Vendors calling to verify payments, managers noting discrepancies, and a subtle shift in the way people interacted with her when she entered the office to make inquiries. It was all unfolding exactly as planned, not through spectacle, but through meticulous preparation, timing, and the controlled use of authority. I walked the floor again, observing, confirming, noting, and when I paused by the shipping area, I allowed a small smile, the kind that carried no sound but all the satisfaction of a man who had finally turned the tide using only strategy, preparation, and the quiet power that comes from understanding every detail of the system you built. By mid-afternoon, the first ripple of confusion had reached Vanessa as she arrived at the office with her high heels clicking against the polished concrete floors, her tailored emerald blazer perfectly pressed, the image of composure she had carefully curated for years. She approached the front desk with a smile, but the receptionist, aware of the temporary freeze on her accounts, met her inquiries with neutral professionalism, directing her to email requests for verification. Vanessa's brow furrowed slightly, her composure cracking just enough to betray the unease she felt. I observed from my office across the warehouse, reviewing operational dashboards, noting shipment confirmations and inventory updates. Each email ping, each phone inquiry she made was logged, documented, and prepared to form the narrative that would solidify her lack of control. I had not reached out, not once, allowing the subtle consequences of her past actions to manifest without interference. In the break room, managers whispered quietly to one another, exchanging glances, careful not to draw attention, but keenly aware that the sudden inaccessibility to funds was not a system error, but a deliberate move. I remembered nights of late auditing, when I cross-referenced hundreds of transactions, checking every account number, every signature, every invoice. I had done this work quietly, consistently, like breathing, never announcing it, never expecting recognition, but knowing it would be invaluable when the time came. And that time had arrived. Vanessa finally connected with Caleb by phone, her voice a mixture of irritation and disbelief, asking how she could access her credit card, her business accounts, and personal spending funds. Caleb spoke with calm authority, providing only the information legally required, refusing to over-explain, knowing that restraint and silence would magnify the impact. I watched her reaction on a live video feed I had in my office for security, noting how quickly her smile faded, how the tension in her posture grew, how her eyes darted toward the walls, as though expecting an unseen observer to intervene. The warehouse continued its rhythm, forklifts moving pallets, workers scanning inventory, the hum of machinery. The ordinary day pressing forward, unaffected by the private upheaval unfolding simultaneously. I allowed myself a deep breath, the kind that carries weight but also clarity, and I walked to the floor, checking in with department heads, reviewing workflow, confirming that operations ran smoothly despite the freeze. Each interaction, each nod, each affirmation reinforced the narrative that I was still present, still competent, still in command, even as the power dynamic between Vanessa and me quietly shifted. By 4 p.m, a series of automated notifications confirmed that all pending transactions she had attempted were blocked, recorded, and legally documented, leaving her without the immediate means to manipulate the accounts she had assumed control over. I moved through the office with purpose, stopping briefly to observe her standing in the corner, reviewing her tablet with a frustration that had once been directed at me, now redirected at the immutable consequences of her own actions. I allowed a subtle, controlled smile, not for pride, but as acknowledgement that the strategy had worked, that patience, evidence, and measured action had created clarity from the confusion she had sought to impose. Emails, phone calls, and internal memos aligned perfectly, a quiet testament to foresight and planning. By the end of the day, she had begun to understand the weight of oversight, the importance of transparency, and the consequences of underestimating the quiet resolve of someone she believed powerless. I returned to my office, sat down, and reviewed the day's communications, checking each log, each confirmation, each timestamp, knowing that the careful documentation would ensure that every move was defensible and unassailable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor, and I allowed the subtle satisfaction of control to settle over me, steady and unspoken, the kind of satisfaction that comes not from spectacle, but from the knowledge that the foundation of authority, carefully constructed and quietly maintained, had finally manifested into visible, undeniable consequence. By early evening, the office lights dimmed slightly as the sky outside deepened to a soft blue, casting elongated shadows across the warehouse floor, and I moved through the space with a deliberate calm, checking on each department and confirming that all operations continued seamlessly despite the underlying tension. Vanessa had retreated to her office, papers spread out before her, her tablet glowing with pending notifications and repeated error messages from the bank, each one a quiet confirmation that her access had been curtailed, and she began to understand the weight of the consequences she had triggered with her own actions. I took a moment to walk along the row of desks where the accounting team was closing out the day, noting the precise alignment of spreadsheets, invoices, and reconciliations, each number verified, each transfer authorized and logged in a way that left no room for misinterpretation or doubt. The contrast between the controlled environment and the storm she was facing privately struck me with clarity. She had assumed the upper hand, believing that her words, her social presence, and her assumed knowledge of the accounts gave her power, and now that illusion was being dismantled methodically, with no spectacle, no confrontation, only the quiet authority of preparation and foresight. At 7:45, I received a brief message from Caleb confirming that the temporary restraining measures on the accounts were now active and legally binding, and that any attempts to circumvent them would be immediately documented and addressed. I placed my phone on the desk, letting the subtle weight of responsibility and control settle over me, knowing that the day would progress without disruption to the business, and that the shift in power dynamics would be felt fully by Vanessa the moment she reviewed the consequences of her actions. I moved to the logistics area, observing the smooth coordination between the dispatch team and the warehouse staff, each forklift operator and delivery coordinator performing their tasks with precision, unaware of the legal and financial adjustments that had quietly rebalanced the authority within the company. My thoughts drifted back to the months prior, recalling small inconsistencies, overlooked invoices, minor transfers that seemed innocuous at the time but now formed a pattern, a trail of intent that Caleb and I had carefully documented, every detail a step in the strategy that had brought the situation to its current equilibrium. By 8:30, the first direct communication from Vanessa arrived via email, a terse inquiry about account access and pending payments, and I allowed it to sit, unread, knowing that the documentation, timestamps, and legal filings in place would speak louder than any immediate response could. I reviewed production schedules, shipment tracking, and client communications, confirming that the business ran on its own merit, not dependent on personal conflict or reactionary intervention, reinforcing the quiet power that comes from systems built with foresight and precision. As the day wore on, the subtle shifts in employee behavior became noticeable, a cautious glance, a quiet confirmation, a muted conversation acknowledging that the landscape had changed, that the balance of control had shifted without a single raised voice or visible confrontation. I returned to my office around 9:15, reviewing the electronic records once more, confirming that every step was documented, every interaction logged, and every potential vulnerability accounted for, ensuring that the groundwork laid over the past hours would be unassailable in the days to come. The office gradually emptied, the hum of machinery fading, leaving a serene quiet punctuated only by the occasional printer or scanner, and I allowed myself a controlled breath, appreciating the deliberate pace, the strategic silence, and the careful orchestration that had brought order and consequence to a situation that could have easily descended into chaos. By the time twilight touched the windows, painting a warm hue across the desks and workstations, I settled into my chair, reviewing the day's outcomes and noting the subtle, yet undeniable, shift in dynamics that had occurred. Vanessa would now perceive the limits of her influence, the importance of foresight, and the quiet but absolute reach of strategic action, all while the company continued to operate efficiently, proof that authority, preparation, and patience often achieve what noise and confrontation cannot. By late evening, The office was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep of the security system confirming locked doors and secured access points. I walked slowly down the main corridor, taking in the organized rows of cubicles and polished floors, noting the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Employees glanced up briefly, sensing the calm authority I carried without a word, aware that something had shifted but not certain of the full extent. Vanessa had retreated to her home office hours earlier, her frustration palpable through the terse emails and repeated phone inquiries that Caleb had handled with steady efficiency. I reflected on the events of the day, how deliberately each action had been measured, from the preparation of scanned financial records to the careful filing of temporary restraining orders, every step designed to maintain composure and legal certainty while ensuring the consequences of her choices became undeniable. The warehouse operations continued seamlessly. Forklifts moved pallets with precision, inventory managers scanned and confirmed shipments, and client communications proceeded as usual, reinforcing the invisible balance of control that now favored careful planning and documentation over impulsive reaction. I paused briefly at the shipping area, observing the coordination between staff and noting that even in my absence from direct confrontation, the systems I had built continued to function flawlessly, a silent testament to foresight and diligence. My thoughts turned to the small details I had noticed over the previous months, the subtle inconsistencies in account statements, the minor transfers that at first seemed trivial, and the offhand comments Vanessa had made believing they would never be traced or questioned. Each detail had now contributed to the carefully constructed response that Caleb and I had implemented, transforming what might have been chaos into structured consequence. I moved to my office, reviewed the electronic logs once more, and confirmed that every action, every transfer attempt, and every communication had been captured and documented, providing a complete record that would support the strategy and safeguard the company. Outside, the last rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I allowed a subtle, controlled breath, feeling the satisfaction that comes not from overt confrontation, but from strategic execution and silent authority. I thought about Vanessa, her perception of control now challenged by the reality that the accounts she assumed were hers to manage were firmly under legal restraint, and how she would begin to understand that the quiet patience, the careful documentation, and the methodical planning I had applied were far more effective than any visible argument or dramatic outburst. By 9:30, all operational reports had been reconciled, every delivery verified, and the business continued to function smoothly, untouched by the personal conflict that had unfolded alongside it. I checked the secure messaging system once more, confirming that Caleb had filed all necessary notices and that the freeze on the accounts was fully in place, legally binding and unassailable. The contrast between the calm in the warehouse and the private turmoil she was experiencing underscored the power of preparation, strategy, and disciplined execution. I walked through the remaining aisles, observing the diligent work of employees who remained unaware of the full story, yet were quietly affected by the shift in dynamics. Each acknowledgement, each nod, each careful glance demonstrated that influence can be exerted silently and effectively without spectacle. As the day transitioned fully into night, I returned to my office, sat in my chair, and reflected on the precise orchestration that had allowed me to maintain composure, assert authority, and ensure the consequences of past neglect and underestimation were now clearly established, all while the company continued to operate at full efficiency, a testament to the quiet but absolute power of foresight, planning, and controlled action. The next morning arrived with a gray sky and a steady rain that tapped against the office windows like fingers on glass. I had slept for less than 3 hours on the leather couch in my office, still wearing yesterday's shirt, my jacket folded over the back of a chair, my shoes lined neatly beside the desk. It was not comfort, but it was quiet, and quiet had become the only place where I could think clearly. At 6:20, I was already reviewing the bank confirmations when my phone lit up with a call from Rachel Hensley. Rachel was Vanessa's closest friend, the kind of woman who had been at every holiday dinner, every charity lunch, every anniversary party where Vanessa performed the role of the elegant wife, while I stood beside her like furniture she had not decided where to place. I stared at the name for 3 rings before answering. Her voice came through low and careful. Daniel, I know I am probably the last person you want to hear from. I said nothing at first. Silence makes people choose the truth faster. Rachel exhaled, and I heard traffic behind her, maybe the sound of tires passing over wet pavement. She is not just angry, she said. She is scared because you moved before she could. That sentence sat in the room with me. I reached for a pen and pulled a yellow legal pad closer. Rachel kept talking, each word measured, like she had practiced them and still hated saying them out loud. She told me Vanessa had been meeting with a divorce attorney for weeks, maybe months. She told me about lunches in Oak Brook, cash withdrawals, notes saved under fake calendar events, and a plan to make me look careless with money while she quietly positioned herself as the responsible partner. I did not interrupt her. My eyes stayed on the rain sliding down the window, turning the city outside into blurred gray lines. People think betrayal arrives as one large moment, one door opening, one sentence spoken, one discovery that changes everything. It does not. Betrayal is usually a file cabinet. One drawer opens, then another, and suddenly you realize the whole thing was built before you ever touched the handle. Rachel's voice tightened. There is something else. I heard paper rustle, then the small click of a car door closing. She said she was going to drain enough from the operating account to force you into a settlement before you could organize yourself. I closed my eyes for 1 second, not from surprise, but from the clean, cold confirmation of what Caleb had already suspected. Then Rachel said the words that changed the shape of the morning. I recorded part of it. My pen stopped moving. Why? I asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. When she answered, the confidence was gone. Because at first I thought she was venting. Then I realized she was planning. There is a difference. I leaned back, letting that line settle into me. There is a difference. Yes, there is. There is a difference between anger and strategy, between frustration and fraud, between a bad marriage and someone quietly sharpening paperwork into a weapon. Rachel offered to send the file to Caleb directly. I gave her his secure email and told her not to contact Vanessa about it. My voice sounded calm, even to me, but underneath that calm, something heavy shifted. Not rage, not victory, something closer to grief with its sleeves rolled up. By 7:10, Caleb had the recording. By 7:40, he called me back. He did not waste time with sympathy. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. This helps, he said. A lot. It supports intent. It supports urgency. It supports preservation of assets. And Daniel, listen carefully. From this point on, you do not speak to her without me. I looked across the office at the framed photograph on the credenza, Vanessa and me at a company gala 7 years earlier, her hand on my chest, my smile tired but real. I remembered that night. We had just landed our first regional contract, and I had been so proud I could barely sit still. Vanessa had whispered, "Let me handle the room. You handle the business." Back then, I thought it was teamwork. Now, the sentence sounded different, like a door closing from the inside. At 8:30, the real storm arrived. Vanessa walked into the building with rain on her coat and anger in her eyes. No smile, no performance, no careful public voice. The receptionist looked up and greeted her politely. Vanessa did not answer. She moved straight past the front desk, past accounting, past the glass wall of the conference room, and into the hallway leading to my office. Every step clicked against the floor with the rhythm of someone who still believed volume could replace authority. I stood before she reached the door. When she entered, her face was pale under perfect makeup, and her phone was clenched in her hand. "My card was declined at Marshall Field," she said, voice shaking with disbelief more than embarrassment. In front of a sales associate. In front of people. I looked at her, then at the chair across from my desk. "Sit down, Vanessa." Her mouth opened, probably to insult me, probably to remind me who she believed I was. But for the first time in a long time, she seemed to notice the folder on my desk, the printed emails, the bank notices, the careful arrangement of proof. She did not sit. She stared at the papers as if they had spoken her name. "What is this?" she asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward her. I simply placed one hand on the folder and said, "This is what happens when someone mistakes trust for blindness." Her eyes lifted to mine, and in that second, I saw it clearly. Not regret. Not yet. Regret requires ownership. What I saw was calculation failing in real time. The room was quiet except for the rain against the window and the distant beeping of a forklift reversing on the warehouse floor. The company kept moving. The world kept moving. But for Vanessa, the ground had finally stopped pretending to be solid. Vanessa's shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible sign of vulnerability I had seen in months, and she stood there silently, scanning the folder on my desk, the legal documents, the screenshots, the account confirmations, and the precise logs of her attempted transactions. She spoke, barely above a whisper. "Daniel, I did not think you would do this." And I let the words hang, neither agreeing nor defending, simply allowing the weight of her realization to settle. I remained seated, calm, observing her as she paced slowly back and forth, her high heels clicking softly against the polished concrete floor, the echo carrying through the otherwise quiet office. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, yet the sound remained a constant backdrop, a reminder that the world moved on, indifferent to personal turmoil, and yet within these walls, consequences had taken shape. I picked up a pen, traced the edge of the folder, and thought back to the careful months of preparation that had led to this moment, cross-referencing statements, reviewing every internal email, compiling the legal notices with Caleb, verifying timestamps, and anticipating her reactions down to the smallest detail. Each step had been measured, deliberate, an exercise in precision rather than emotion, because I had learned that true control is quiet, methodical, and requires patience. Vanessa stopped pacing and looked directly at me, her green eyes wide, her voice a mixture of disbelief and something approaching awe. "All of this, how did you even notice?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I gestured toward the documents. The folder was thick with proof, organized by date, account, and relevance. Every attempt she had made to manipulate funds, to shift responsibility, to conceal her actions, was recorded and presented logically. "I noticed because I pay attention," I said finally, voice even and controlled, not rising, not trembling, just stating a fact. "I am not blind to the things that matter, Vanessa." She exhaled sharply and turned to look out the window at the city streets glistening wet in the morning light. "I thought I had all the leverage," she murmured, more to herself than to me. And for the first time I understood that she was beginning to grasp the difference between perception and reality, between assumed control and demonstrated authority. I stood and walked slowly to the large floor-to-ceiling windows behind my desk, looking out at the skyline, letting the silence between us stretch, because silence communicates as loudly as any word. The office remained operational, staff moving efficiently through the day's tasks, unaware of the private tension that had rearranged the hierarchy of power in this space. I returned to my chair and opened my laptop, reviewing a few additional reports, noting that everything aligned with the freeze orders, every department unaffected operationally, and that the structure I had built functioned independently of personal conflict. Vanessa watched, quiet now, not asking questions, not making statements, only absorbing. By mid-morning, she had begun sending brief emails, her tone clipped, professional, a stark contrast to the arrogance and entitlement of previous days, and I observed each one as if cataloging the change in strategy, the subtle acknowledgement of her limitations. Caleb called briefly to confirm that all legal filings were intact, that the freezes remained in place, and that her attempts to circumvent any restriction would be met immediately with documented action. I noted the time, 15 minutes past 10, and placed the phone on the desk. The office atmosphere remained steady, normal, yet the undercurrent had shifted, a quiet recognition that authority had changed hands without spectacle or confrontation, only through preparation, documentation, and restraint. Vanessa approached my desk, the sound of her heels muted now, her voice steady but quiet. "Daniel, what happens next?" I looked up slowly, measured, and said, "Now we proceed with clarity. Every action is documented. Every step forward will be accounted for. We act within the rules, not in reaction." Her eyes met mine, a complex mix of recognition, hesitation, and the dawning realization of her position. And in that moment, I understood that the quiet patience, meticulous preparation, and methodical execution had succeeded. The office continued its rhythm around us, the rain outside now a faint patter, and for the first time in months, I felt a calm certainty that consequence had arrived without chaos. that strategy had replaced. Confrontation, and that authority, once assumed, had now been quietly and fully restored. By noon, Caleb arrived with a black leather briefcase in one hand and the expression of a man who had already seen the next 3 moves. He did not look at Vanessa when he entered my office. He looked at me, then at the folder on the desk, then at the chair beside the window, as if the room itself had become part of the record. Vanessa was standing near the bookshelves with her arms folded, no longer pacing, no longer performing outrage, just watching the door, as if one more adult entering the room made the situation harder to bend. Caleb set his briefcase on the conference table and opened it with a soft click. That sound did something strange to the air. It made everything official. He removed a stack of documents, each one clipped, labeled, and arranged in the order of consequence. "Vanessa," he said, calm and formal. "From this point forward, all financial communication should go through counsel. The court has granted temporary restraints on disputed accounts, and any attempt to move, conceal, redirect, or pressure access to funds will be documented." She let out a small laugh, but it had no strength in it. It was the kind of laugh people use when the door they plan to walk through has been locked from the other side. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Those accounts are part of my life." Caleb nodded once. "They are part of the case now." The words landed harder than any argument could have. I sat behind my desk and watched her absorb them, not because I enjoyed it, but because I needed to see the moment clearly. For years, Vanessa had turned rooms into stages. At dinners, she had controlled the story. At fundraisers, she had controlled the introductions. At home, she controlled the temperature of every conversation, deciding when I was allowed to speak, when my concerns were boring, when my questions were suspicious, when my silence proved I had nothing to offer. But this room did not belong to her performance anymore. It belonged to documents, dates, signatures, and the quiet patience of facts. Caleb slid the first page across the table. "This is the emergency preservation order. This is the bank confirmation. This is the schedule of disputed withdrawals. This is the recorded statement from a witness indicating intent to deplete operating funds before formal filing." Vanessa's eyes moved quickly from page to page, and I saw the exact second Rachel's involvement registered. Her face changed, not dramatically, but enough. The color left her cheeks in a slow retreat. "Rachel talked to you?" she asked. Caleb did not answer the question the way she wanted. A witness provided relevant information. Vanessa looked at me then, and for the first time since that dinner, her voice softened into something almost human. "Daniel, this does not have to become ugly." I folded my hands on the desk. "It became ugly when you thought humiliation was harmless because it was public and theft was safe because it was quiet." She flinched at the word, but I did not take it back. Some words are not insults. Some words are measurements. Caleb remained still, letting the silence work. Outside the office windows, the warehouse moved in steady rhythm. A forklift beeped in reverse. A printer started somewhere near accounting. Rainwater slid from the roof in thin silver lines. Normal life kept going, and maybe that was what made the moment cut so cleanly. Nothing had exploded. No one was shouting. The world did not need drama to recognize the truth. Vanessa sank slowly into the chair across from me, the same chair where vendors used to sit while asking for better terms, where employees sat when they needed help with a payroll mistake, where men and women came in believing I would listen before I decided. She looked smaller there than I expected, but I reminded myself that looking small is not the same as being innocent. "What do you want?" she asked. I looked at the photograph on the credenza one last time. The gala, the old smile, the younger version of me who thought loyalty meant giving someone enough rope and trusting them not to pull the house down with it. Then I looked back at her. Separation of personal and business assets. Full accounting. No more access without approval. No more stories told on my behalf. And we proceed with the divorce. Cleanly. The word divorce filled the room like a bell that had been struck once and left to ring. Vanessa's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. I was grateful for that. I did not want theater. I wanted clarity. She opened her mouth, closed it, then looked down at the documents as if they were written in a language she had once mocked and now needed to understand. Caleb stood. "You will have time to review everything with your attorney," he said. "But the restrictions are active now." Vanessa rose slowly. At the door, she turned back toward me, and for a second I thought she might apologize. Instead, she said. I never thought you would actually choose the business over me. I stood then, not quickly, not angrily, just enough to make the line between us visible. No, I said. I chose the truth over the version of me you needed to keep under your thumb. She had no answer for that. After she left, the office felt larger. Caleb gathered his papers, but I stayed by the window, watching her cross the parking lot under a gray Illinois sky. She moved carefully, avoiding puddles, one hand gripping her phone, the other clutching a folder that had changed the shape of her day. My phone buzzed with a message from accounting confirming payroll was clear, vendors were paid, and the operating account was secure. I read it and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Not joy, not triumph. Peace, maybe. The plain kind. The kind that does not need an audience. Caleb stepped beside me and said, "You handled that well." I looked out at the rows of trucks waiting at the loading docks, each one carrying something built by years of early mornings, hard calls, signed checks, and quiet sacrifice. I should have handled it sooner, I said. He shook his head. You handled it when you had proof. That stayed with me. Because proof changes everything. Pain tells you something is wrong, but proof gives you a door. That afternoon, I went back to work. I signed delivery approvals, met with operations, checked the new inventory schedule, and walked the floor like I had done 1,000 times before. Only this time, the silence around me did not feel like surrender. It felt like ownership. By 5 o'clock, the rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds over the warehouse roof, turning the wet pavement gold. I stood outside beside my expedition, breathing in the cold air, holding my keys in one hand and the empty coffee cup in the other. For years, I thought being a good husband meant absorbing every slight, every insult, every quiet erasure, because patience was supposed to prove love. I was wrong. Patience without boundaries is just permission with better manners. Vanessa had called me useless because I refused to fight dirty. She forgot that clean hands can still sign powerful papers. I got into the truck, started the engine, and drove away from the office without looking back at the building. Not because I was leaving it behind, but because, for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what still belonged to me.